Homelander's fist came down hard enough to crater the street, flipping cars and blowing out every window along the block. People screamed, cameras shook, and dust swallowed the scene. When it cleared, the man in black was still standing there with his hands in his pockets, looking mildly curious, like someone watching an experiment go slightly off script. Homelander struck again, faster this time, his expression already shifting from anger to confusion. The air ruptured around the impact, but the stranger's body did not move. The punch never reached him. It stopped short, as if an invisible wall had decided this was far enough. Heat vision followed at point-blank range, bright enough to melt steel. The beams bent away from the man's face, curving unnaturally and slicing into buildings behind him. People watching from rooftops realized something was deeply wrong. The stranger tilted his head and smiled. And for the first time in his life, Homelander took a step back, while Vought's surveillance teams began to panic over what they were seeing. You're about to watch a world built on fear begin to fracture in ways no one can control. Subscribe, because every choice from this point forward creates consequences that will echo across this story, and you will need to see who survives what comes next. The street still smoked from the force of Homelander's blows when the stranger finally moved. Not to defend himself, not to retaliate, but simply to take a slow step forward as if he were crossing a quiet sidewalk instead of the remains of a battlefield. His hands stayed in his pockets, posture relaxed, eyes half-lidded with mild curiosity. He looked at Homelander the way a teacher looks at a student who just made a very loud, very embarrassing mistake. People were filming from windows and rooftops. Live streams were already exploding across social media. News drones circled overhead, feeding Vought a live nightmare from 12 different angles. None of the footage made sense. The impacts were real. The destruction was real. But the stranger in black stood untouched at the center of it, all like the laws of physics had quietly decided to stop applying to him. Homelander hovered a few feet above the ground, chest rising and falling faster than he wanted anyone to notice. His eyes never left the man's face. He had hit tanks harder than that. He had ripped planes out of the sky. Yet this man hadn't even flinched. "Okay," Homelander said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That was funny, your turn." The stranger blinked once behind dark lenses. "My turn for what?" The tone wasn't mocking. It wasn't afraid. It was genuinely conversational, like Homelander had just asked him to pass the salt at dinner. That was the moment something unfamiliar crept into Homelander's chest. Not fear, something worse, loss of control. Inside Vought Tower, alarms weren't blaring, but they might as well have been. Analysts stared at screens filled with biometric readings, satellite feeds, and thermal scans that refused to give them anything useful. The stranger's body temperature was normal. His heart rate was steady. There were no signs of stress, no energy signatures, no detectable compound V markers. It was like watching a civilian calmly stand in the middle of a hurricane. Ashley Barrett was shouting into 3 phones at once. "I don't care what you think it is. Just tell me why Homelander can't touch him." No one had an answer. Back on the street, Homelander moved faster than a bullet. He circled behind the stranger and slammed his fist toward the back of his head. The result was the same. His knuckles stopped in midair, hovering inches away, unable to move forward no matter how much force he applied. The stranger didn't even turn around. He sighed softly. "You know, most people at least introduce themselves first." Homelander pulled his hand back and stared at it like it had betrayed him. He tried again, slower this time, watching carefully as his fist approached the invisible boundary. It felt like pushing against solid steel that wasn't there. "What are you?" Homelander demanded. The stranger finally turned to face him. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Satoru Gojo, teacher." That answer only made things worse. From a nearby alley, Billy Butcher watched the entire exchange with narrowed eyes. Huey stood beside him, mouth slightly open, unable to process what he was seeing. Starlight had her hands pressed against the brick wall, peeking around the corner in disbelief. Is he a Supe?" Huey whispered. Butcher didn't answer right away. He had seen Supes bleed. He had seen them panic, scream, beg. This man looked like he was waiting for a bus. "Doesn't move like one," Butcher muttered. Gojo's gaze drifted past Homelander for just a second, and his eyes paused on the civilians watching from a distance. His expression didn't change, but something behind the lenses sharpened. He had already taken in the scene the moment he arrived. The destruction, the fear, the way people looked at Homelander with a mixture of worship and terror. He understood the system immediately. Artificial power, manufactured idols, controlled by a corporation pretending to be a government. "How fascinating," he murmured. Homelander heard it. "What did you say?" Gojo looked back at him. "I said you're fascinating." Homelander's jaw tightened. Compliments weren't supposed to feel like insults. He fired his heat vision again, this time sweeping it across Gojo's entire body. The beams warped and split around him like water hitting a rock, carving glowing scars into the buildings behind. Gojo leaned slightly to the side to watch where the beams landed. "Careful," he said casually, "you'll hurt someone." That tone, that calm, effortless tone, it was starting to dig under Homelander's skin in a way punches never had. In Vought Tower, someone finally spoke up. "We're not detecting any force field. There's no energy barrier. It's like space itself is distorted around him." Ashley stopped yelling. "What does that mean?" "It means," the analyst said slowly, "Homelander isn't being blocked. He's never actually reaching him." Back on the street, Homelander's smile was completely gone. Gojo tilted his head slightly. "You're very strong for this place." "For this place," Homelander repeated. Gojo nodded once. "You're used to being the strongest, aren't you?" The words were gentle, curious, like a teacher confirming a student's background before starting a lesson. Something snapped. Homelander lunged forward again, grabbing for Gojo's collar. His hand stopped midair, trembling with effort, veins bulging in his forearm. He pushed harder, teeth clenched, face twisting in frustration as nothing happened. Gojo didn't move. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "you rely a lot on people being afraid of you." That was when Butcher realized this wasn't going to be a fight. This was a dismantling. Sirens began to echo in the distance as police and emergency vehicles approached the ruined street. News helicopters hovered above, broadcasting everything live. Millions of people were now watching their world's strongest hero fail to touch a man who looked bored. And Gojo could feel all of it. The fear, the confusion, the fragile illusion cracking in real time. His smile faded just slightly, not from seriousness, but from interest. He was starting to understand what kind of world he had stepped into. And somewhere deep inside Vought Tower, executives were beginning to realize something far worse than a rogue Supe had appeared. This man wasn't part of their system. He didn't belong to it, which meant they had no way to control what happened next. Homelander had never been ignored before. People feared him, worshipped him, lied to him, obeyed him, but they never looked at him the way this man did. Gojo's gaze wasn't hostile or impressed. It was evaluative, like he was observing a strange animal in a controlled environment. That calm curiosity felt more insulting than any insult could have been. Around them, the city was paralyzed. Phones recorded. Helicopters hovered. Police kept their distance because none of them knew what rule applied to a situation where Homelander wasn't winning. For the first time, the world's most powerful symbol of control looked like he didn't understand what was happening. Gojo noticed all of it without turning his head. His eyes, hidden behind dark lenses, tracked everything with quiet precision. The civilians trembling behind cars, the cameras zooming in. The way Homelander's breathing had subtly changed. He could read the emotional temperature of the entire street like it was printed in the air. "You're thinking very loudly," Gojo said casually. Homelander froze. "What?" "You're trying to figure out if I'm bluffing," Gojo continued. "You're wondering if there's some trick you haven't figured out yet. You're also very aware that a few million people are watching you fail to touch me." The words weren't aggressive. They were matter-of-fact. That made them worse. Inside Vought Tower, the panic had shifted from confusion to damage control. PR teams were already drafting statements. Executives were arguing over whether to cut the feed or spin it. The problem was that every civilian with a phone had already become a broadcaster. Ashley stared at the screens, pale. "We need to get Homelander out of there." No one volunteered to tell him that. Back on the street, Homelander's smile returned, but it was forced and tight. "You think this is funny?" Gojo tilted his head slightly. "I think it's interesting." Homelander shot upward into the sky, then dove down at full speed, creating a sonic boom that rattled the entire block. He slammed into Gojo like a missile. The ground exploded. A shockwave blasted outward, flipping police cars and shattering the remaining windows in the area. Dust swallowed everything again. When it cleared, Gojo was standing in the exact same spot. He hadn't even adjusted his footing. He brushed a piece of debris off his sleeve. That was impressive, very loud. Something in Homelander's eyes shifted. The usual controlled arrogance was cracking into raw frustration. He wasn't performing anymore. He was trying to understand why his reality wasn't working. From the alley, Huey swallowed hard. He's breaking him." Butcher nodded slowly, "and he ain't even trying." Starlight couldn't look away. For the first time since she joined the Seven, she was watching someone who didn't seem afraid of Homelander at all. It felt unreal. It felt safe. Gojo glanced briefly in their direction, and for just a moment his expression softened. He had already identified them as different, not part of the same structure as the others, observers, not enforcers. Then his attention returned to Homelander. "You've never met anyone stronger than you, have you?" Gojo asked. Homelander didn't answer. His jaw was clenched too tight. "That must be lonely," Gojo added. "That did it." Homelander grabbed a nearby car and hurled it at Gojo with enough force to crush a building. The vehicle crumpled midair as it reached him, flattening like it had hit an invisible wall before dropping uselessly to the ground. Gojo sighed softly. "You're going to hurt someone doing that." "Shut up," Homelander roared. The shout echoed down the street, louder than any explosion so far. And that was the moment the world saw it. Not a god. A man losing control. In Vought Tower, a senior executive whispered, "This is a disaster." Because this wasn't a fight they could spin. It was a public unraveling. Gojo studied Homelander quietly, 6 eyes processing everything with terrifying clarity. The unstable ego, the dependency on fear, the psychological structure propped up by worship and intimidation. He didn't need anyone to explain Compound V to him. He could already see it in Homelander's energy, in the way his power sat unnaturally in his body. Artificial. Forced. Unstable. "How tragic," Gojo murmured. Homelander heard it again. "What did you say?" Gojo's smile returned. "You didn't choose this, did you?" That question hit harder than any attack. For a split second, Homelander hesitated, and everyone watching saw it. Butcher exhaled slowly. He's not fighting him, he's dissecting him. Sirens grew louder as more authorities arrived, but no one dared step closer. The entire city block had become a stage for something no one understood. Gojo finally took his hands out of his pockets. Homelander stiffened immediately. Gojo raised one finger, examining it like he was considering whether to demonstrate something. "I don't want to embarrass you in front of everyone," he said lightly. "But if you keep escalating, I might have to." Homelander's eyes flicked to the cameras, to the helicopters, to the crowds watching from a distance. He realized something horrifying. This man wasn't threatening him. He was offering him a chance to stop. And that felt like mercy. Homelander slowly lowered himself to the ground, breathing hard, not defeated, not yet, but shaken in a way he had never experienced before. Gojo noticed the shift immediately. He smiled again, satisfied. Lesson understood. But as his gaze drifted across the street, past the destruction, past the fear in civilians' faces, something else caught his attention. A Vought emergency vehicle pulling up. And inside it, a small, frightened child being rushed away under heavy guard. Gojo's eyes followed the child silently. His smile faded for the first time. The Vought emergency vehicle tried to move discreetly through the chaos, escorted by armed security and shielded from cameras as best as possible. To everyone else, it looked like standard corporate damage control. To Gojo, it stood out immediately. The fear inside that vehicle felt different from the fear in the street. It was smaller, younger. He turned his head slightly, following it with his eyes while Homelander stood only a few feet away, still trying to regain his composure. That tiny shift in attention told Homelander something he didn't like. He was no longer the most interesting thing here. "What are you looking at?" Homelander asked. Gojo didn't answer. He simply stepped sideways, and the motion was so casual it took a second for anyone to realize he had moved at all. One moment he was in front of Homelander. The next, he was standing directly in the path of the departing vehicle. The driver slammed the brakes. Security guards jumped out with rifles raised, shouting orders that made no sense even to them. They were trained to deal with terrorists, not men who broke physics. Gojo raised one hand politely. "Hi." Inside the vehicle, a young boy no older than 8 stared back at him with wide, terrified eyes. An IV line was still taped to his arm. His skin looked pale, sickly. There were faint bruises where needles had been inserted repeatedly. Gojo didn't need anyone to explain. 6 eyes read the energy in the boy's body instantly. It was wrong, forced into him. A foreign substance pushing against his natural life force like a parasite trying to take root. Compound V. Gojo's expression didn't change dramatically, but something behind his smile went still. Homelander landed beside him. "That's classified Vought business. Step away." Gojo didn't even look at him. "You do this to children." The question was calm, too calm. "It creates heroes," Homelander replied automatically, like he had said this line 1,000 times. Gojo glanced at him briefly. "No, it creates weapons." The guards opened fire, not because they thought it would work, but because they didn't know what else to do. Bullets froze in midair inches from Gojo's body, clattering harmlessly to the ground one by one. Gojo's attention never left the boy. "Does it hurt?" he asked softly. The child nodded. That was the moment the tone shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but anyone watching felt it. The playful curiosity that had defined Gojo's demeanor until now receded slightly, replaced by a quiet focus that hadn't been there before. From the alley, Starlight felt it immediately. "He's different," she whispered. Butcher watched carefully. He just found his reason. Inside Vought Tower, executives were now fully aware this situation had gone from PR disaster to existential threat. They were watching a man who could not be stopped take an interest in something they had buried for decades. Ashley's voice shook. "We need Homelander to remove him now." But Homelander wasn't moving. He was watching Gojo, and for the first time, he wasn't thinking about dominance. He was trying to understand what had changed. Gojo crouched slightly to be at eye level with the boy through the vehicle window. "Don't worry," he said gently. "I'm just looking." He wasn't lying. He was analyzing the compound V at a level no Vought scientist could comprehend. He could see how it rewrote the body, how it forced power where it didn't belong, how unstable it was in a developing child. His smile returned, but it no longer carried amusement. It carried judgment. He stood up slowly and turned to Homelander. "They did this to you too, didn't they?" Homelander stiffened. "That's none of your business." Gojo nodded once. "I thought so." There was no pity in his voice, only confirmation. Around them, cameras were still rolling. Millions were still watching, but the spectacle had changed. This wasn't about Homelander failing to hit someone anymore. It was about something much deeper being exposed in real time. Gojo stepped away from the vehicle, allowing it to pass. The guards didn't understand why they were still alive. Homelander watched the vehicle go, then looked back at Gojo. "You don't know what you're talking about." Gojo slipped his hands back into his pockets. "I know exactly what I'm talking about." There was no playfulness left in his tone now, just quiet certainty. And that certainty was more unsettling than anything he had done so far. Butcher stepped out of the alley. It was a risk, but he didn't care. He needed to be closer to this. Huey and Starlight followed hesitantly behind him. Gojo noticed them immediately. "Ah," he said lightly, as if greeting students arriving late to class. "You three seem different from the rest." Butcher eyed him carefully. "You some kind of soup?" Gojo smiled. "Not the kind you're used to." Butcher nodded toward Homelander. "You planning to finish this?" Gojo glanced at Homelander, then back at Butcher. "There's nothing to finish." That answer confused everyone. "What do you mean?" Huey asked. Gojo looked around at the destroyed street, the cameras, the shaken god hovering silently nearby. This already did what it needed to do. And he was right. The world had just seen Homelander fail. Vought had just been exposed experimenting on children in front of a man who could not be controlled. And Gojo had just decided this system was rotten. Homelander felt it too. Something had shifted beyond his ability to fix with force. Gojo turned his head slightly toward Vought Tower in the distance. He didn't need to see inside it to know the kind of people sitting there. He had dealt with their type before. Corrupt officials managing power they didn't understand. His smile returned faintly. "This place is very interesting," he said. And for the first time since arriving, it sounded like a promise. Vought did not sleep that night. Entire departments were pulled into emergency meetings as footage from the street played on repeat across every monitor in the tower. Analysts slowed frames down to fractions of seconds, trying to find evidence of a force field, a device, a trick, anything that could be categorized and countered. Every test came back with the same impossible conclusion. There was nothing stopping Homelander's attacks. He simply never reached the man. Executives argued over terminology because none of them wanted to say the truth out loud. If this stranger was not using Compound V, then Vought had no leverage over him. No contracts, no handlers, no psychological conditioning. He was power without a leash, and that terrified them more than any rogue Supe ever had. Ashley stood at the head of the room with dark circles under her eyes, listening to experts fail to sound confident. "So what you're telling me," she said slowly, "is that Homelander is not the strongest being on the planet anymore." No one answered. Across the city, Gojo walked calmly down a sidewalk like a tourist with time to spare. The destroyed street had been sealed off behind him, but the videos had already spread worldwide. People stared as he passed, whispering, unsure if they should be afraid or relieved. He gave them a small, polite smile like he was aware they were nervous and didn't blame them for it. Behind him, at a cautious distance, Butcher and the others followed. They hadn't agreed to it out loud, but none of them wanted to lose sight of him. Huey kept glancing at Gojo's back, still trying to reconcile what he had seen. Starlight felt something she hadn't felt in years, hope mixed with confusion. Butcher finally called out, "You planning to explain what you are?" Gojo didn't stop walking. I already did, I'm a teacher. That don't answer the question, Butcher replied. Gojo chuckled softly. It answers more than you think. Inside Vought Tower, a decision was made. They couldn't confront him physically. That was clear. So they would try the method that had worked on every Supe before him. Public image, negotiation, recruitment. If he couldn't be stopped, maybe he could be brought inside the system. A sleek black SUV pulled up ahead of Gojo on the sidewalk. Corporate representatives stepped out, wearing carefully controlled smiles. Cameras had already been positioned at a distance to capture what they hoped would look like a peaceful introduction. Gojo stopped walking and looked at the vehicle with mild curiosity. One of the representatives approached carefully. Mr. Gojo, Vought International would like to speak with you, privately. Gojo glanced at the cameras, then back at the man. You don't do anything privately, do you? The man hesitated. We believe you and Vought share similar goals, protecting people, creating heroes. Gojo smiled wider. You manufacture them. The man's smile faltered slightly. We enhance human potential for the greater good. Gojo tilted his head. By injecting children with unstable chemicals. Butcher watched from a distance, impressed. The man hadn't even been in this world for a day, and he already understood it better than most people who lived in it. The representative tried to recover. We'd like to offer you a place among the 7. Gojo laughed, not loudly but genuinely amused. I don't join broken systems, I observe them. That sentence was transmitted live across the city by dozens of phones. Inside Vought Tower, executives felt their stomachs drop. This was exactly what they didn't want. He wasn't tempted, he wasn't impressed, he wasn't playing along. Homelander watched the broadcast alone in a private room. His jaw was tight as he listened to Gojo speak. Every word felt like it was peeling something away from him in front of the world. Gojo stepped closer to the representative. Tell me something, he said casually. What happens when people stop being afraid of your heroes? The man didn't answer. Because that's happening right now, Gojo added. He stepped around the SUV and continued walking, leaving the representative standing there with nothing to say. The cameras followed him instead of the Vought team, and that was the moment Vought realized they had lost control of the narrative. Butcher caught up to him. You just turned them down on live television. Gojo shrugged. They weren't offering anything interesting. Starlight studied him carefully. You knew they'd try that. Gojo nodded. People who build systems like this always think power can be negotiated. He paused slightly, looking up at the skyline where Vought Tower stood tall and polished. His expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp behind the lenses. They're starting to understand they can't control me, he said. At that exact moment, inside the tower, a new order was given. If they couldn't control him, they would contain him. Surveillance teams were deployed across the city. Military-grade weapons were quietly moved into position, not to attack, but to prepare for the possibility that they might have to. And Gojo could feel it. He didn't need to see them to know he was being watched from every angle. The intent in the air had changed. Curiosity had turned into fear. He smiled faintly. Ah, he said, now it's getting interesting. Behind him, sirens echoed in the distance again, not from police this time, but from armored Vought response units mobilizing across multiple streets at once. Something had already been set in motion. And this time, it was Homelander who had triggered it. By the time the first armored Vought vehicles rolled into position, the plan had already failed in ways no one inside the tower wanted to admit. They weren't deploying to stop Gojo. They were deploying because they didn't know what else to do. Military contractors, private security, and Supe response teams were quietly positioned across several blocks, instructed to wait for a signal that never came. The order was simple. Observe, contain if possible, Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Gojo noticed them immediately. He didn't turn his head, he didn't change direction, but his smile widened slightly as if he had just spotted something mildly entertaining in the distance. The intent in the air was loud to him, nervous, coordinated, afraid. Behind him, Butcher followed with a grim expression. They're mobilizing half the city for you. Gojo nodded. They're not here for me, they're here for their own comfort. Huey glanced around at the subtle positioning of armored units at intersections. This is what they do before something big, isn't it? Starlight answered quietly. They're trying to make it look like they still have control. Ahead, a barricade of vehicles suddenly blocked the street. Heavily armed personnel stepped out, forming a line, not aiming yet, just standing there as a show of authority. Loudspeakers crackled to life. Mr. Gojo, please remain where you are. We need to escort you to a secure location for your own safety. Gojo stopped walking and looked at them with mild interest. My safety. One of the officers swallowed. Yes, sir. Gojo glanced at Butcher over his shoulder. They're adorable. Butcher almost smirked. You gonna let them try? Gojo turned back to the barricade and took a step forward. Immediately, rifles were raised. The tension in the air spiked so sharply that even civilians watching from windows held their breath. I'm not going anywhere, Gojo said pleasantly, but you're welcome to try moving me. Inside Vought Tower, executives leaned forward in their chairs. This was the moment they had been preparing for. If they could show even the slightest ability to contain him, the illusion of control could be salvaged. A command was given. High-frequency sonic emitters activated from the vehicles, blasting an invisible wave designed to disorient Supes. At the same time, a specialized net fired from above, woven from experimental materials strong enough to restrain the most powerful members of the Seven. The net froze in midair before reaching him. The sonic waves hit him and dispersed like wind against a wall. Gojo looked up at the suspended net curiously. Oh, that's new. He raised one finger. The net crumpled inward as if gravity had suddenly reversed on itself, collapsing into a tight ball before dropping harmlessly to the ground. The armored personnel stared in disbelief. Gojo lowered his hand. You should really stop before someone gets embarrassed. The officers hesitated, unsure whether to continue or retreat. Their orders hadn't accounted for this level of impossibility. From a rooftop vantage point, Vought snipers received a final instruction: test his limits. They fired. The bullets never reached him. They slowed, stopped, and fell like raindrops at his feet. Gojo looked down at them. You're being very rude. But the real damage wasn't physical, it was psychological. Civilians were watching this unfold live. They weren't seeing a rogue Supe rampaging through the city. They were seeing Vought throw everything they had at a man who looked mildly inconvenienced. The image of corporate authority was dissolving in real time. Butcher exhaled slowly. They're panicking. Gojo nodded. Good. Inside Vought Tower, voices were raised. Someone suggested sending Homelander again. Someone else immediately shot that down. The last thing they needed was a repeat of the earlier humiliation. Ashley's voice trembled. We have to stop this broadcast. But it was too late. Every phone in the city had already done their job. Gojo stepped forward again, and the line of armored personnel instinctively stepped back. No one had told them to retreat. Their bodies simply made the decision for them. That was when Gojo noticed something else. A Vought insignia on one of the vehicles. A small symbol he had seen earlier on the emergency van carrying the child. His gaze lingered on it for just a second longer than usual. His smile faded slightly. Where do you take them? He asked calmly. No one answered. The children, Gojo clarified. The silence that followed was louder than any gunshot. Behind him, Starlight felt a chill. She had seen that look before in other people, people who had just connected dots they couldn't ignore. Gojo turned his head slowly toward Vought Tower in the distance. He wasn't guessing anymore. He was certain. "They're not trying to contain me," he said softly. Butcher frowned. "What do you mean?" Gojo's voice remained calm. "They're trying to protect something from me." That realization hit everyone at once. The barricade, the distraction, the show of force. It wasn't about stopping Gojo from moving forward. It was about buying time. And Gojo understood exactly what kind of thing a system like this would try to hide when threatened. He took one step to the side. Then he vanished. Not in a blur, not with a flash. He was simply no longer there. The armored line stood frozen, staring at the empty space where he had been. Butcher's eyes widened. Where the hell did he? He stopped mid-sentence as every phone in the area began lighting up with alerts. Security breach, Vought Research Division. And inside the tower, alarms finally began to scream. The alarms inside Vought Tower had never sounded like this before. Not for terrorists, not for data breaches, not even for internal Supes incidents. This was a full system panic triggered by something that security cameras could not track. One moment the research corridors were empty. The next, a tall man in black was walking through them as if he had always been there. Gojo moved at an unhurried pace, hands in his pockets, observing everything with quiet attention. Scientists and staff froze in place as he passed, too shocked to scream, too confused to run. He wasn't threatening them. He wasn't rushing. He was simply present in a place that was supposed to be inaccessible. Six eyes absorbed the environment instantly. Refrigerated storage units, chemical vats, surgical rooms, data terminals showing biometric readings of children. Gojo didn't need labels to understand what he was seeing. The entire facility reeked of forced evolution and controlled suffering. A security team turned a corner and stopped dead when they saw him. One of them raised a weapon with shaking hands. Gojo glanced at the gun, then at the man holding it. "You don't want to do that." The man lowered it without realizing he had made the choice. Gojo continued walking. Inside the control room, executives watched him move through their most secret research floor like a ghost. They tried locking doors ahead of him. He simply walked through the sealed entrances as if they were made of air. No explosions, no damage, just quiet violation of everything they believed was secure. Ashley's voice cracked. "How is he doing that?" No one answered. Gojo stopped in front of a reinforced observation window. On the other side of the glass, several children lay in medical beds, IV lines running into their arms. Some were asleep. Some were crying quietly. Monitors tracked unstable readings across every screen. He stood there silently for several seconds. The playful smile he wore so easily was gone. One of the scientists inside the room backed away slowly. "He's not supposed to be here." Gojo stepped through the glass. Not breaking it, not opening it, simply passing through the space it occupied. The room fell completely silent as he entered. He looked at the nearest child, a girl no older than 6, trembling under the weight of something her body didn't understand. His eyes softened, but his expression remained controlled. "So this is where it happens," he said quietly. A doctor tried to speak. "We're helping them. We're stabilizing their abilities." Gojo turned his head slightly toward him. "You're forcing something into them that doesn't belong." The doctor couldn't respond. 6 eyes traced the compound V in their bodies with terrifying clarity. He could see how it rewrote their biology, how it clashed with their natural energy, how unstable it was. It wasn't enhancement, it was invasion. Behind reinforced glass in the control room, executives watched the moment they had feared. Gojo finally looked angry. Not loud, not explosive, but still. He reached out and gently touched the air above the girl's chest, careful not to make physical contact. He was analyzing the structure of the compound at a level Vought's best scientists could never reach. And in that moment, he understood something that made this far worse. "They don't know how to stop it once it starts," he said softly. The scientists in the room exchanged nervous glances. Gojo looked at them. "You're experimenting without understanding the consequences." A trembling voice came through the intercom from the control room. "Mr. Gojo, we can explain." He looked up toward the ceiling, directly at the camera. "You already did." Back outside the tower, Butcher, Huey, and Starlight stared at their phones as footage from inside Vought began leaking. Someone in the building had started streaming, and the world was now seeing what had been hidden for decades. Huey's voice shook. "Oh my God." Starlight covered her mouth. Butcher didn't say anything. His jaw was tight, eyes fixed on the screen. Inside the lab, Gojo straightened up slowly. His expression had changed in a way no one had seen yet. The amusement was gone. The curiosity was gone. What remained was quiet judgment. He turned toward the camera again. "You built your entire world on this." The statement wasn't a question. Alarms continued to blare throughout the tower, but no one was trying to stop him anymore. They were too busy realizing the damage was already done. The world was watching the truth in real time. Gojo stepped toward the exit of the lab. "You've been very careless," he said calmly. And for the first time since arriving in this world, his tone carried a weight that made everyone listening feel something close to dread. Because this wasn't the voice of someone amused by a broken system. This was the voice of someone who had decided it needed to be corrected. The silence inside the research floor felt heavier than the alarms. Scientists stood frozen beside their equipment, unsure whether they were witnessing a rescue or a judgment. The children in the bed stirred weakly, some crying, some staring at the stranger in black with confused eyes. Gojo looked at each of them carefully, and for the first time since arriving in this world, there was no trace of amusement in his expression. He wasn't smiling anymore. Up in the control room, executives whispered over each other, trying to decide whether to cut power, release gas into the room, or seal the entire floor. Every option sounded insane when spoken out loud. None of them addressed the real problem, which was that the man walking through their most secret facility did not operate under any rule they understood. Gojo raised one hand slightly and traced the air above the nearest child again. He wasn't touching her. He didn't need to. 6 eyes mapped the compound V inside her body with surgical precision. He could see where it was fighting her natural energy, forcing changes that her body wasn't ready to accept. His jaw tightened, just enough for those watching to notice. "You're not enhancing them," he said quietly. "You're gambling with their lives." A scientist finally found his voice. "We're stabilizing the formula. It's safer now than it's ever been." Gojo looked at him. "That's not a comforting sentence." Outside the tower, crowds had gathered, staring up at the screens broadcasting the breach. News outlets had abandoned speculation and were now simply replaying the live feed. The narrative had shifted completely. This was no longer about a mysterious man confronting Homelander. This was about the truth behind how heroes were made. Butcher watched with a grim expression. "He's doing what we've been trying to do for years," he muttered. Starlight nodded slowly, "But he's doing it without trying." Inside the lab, Gojo finally stepped back from the children. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't rushing. He was thinking, calculating the system in front of him like a problem that had just revealed its core flaw. He turned toward the exit. "That's enough," he said softly. Up in the control room, one executive whispered, "What does that mean?" They got their answer seconds later. Across the entire research floor, every locked door, every reinforced barrier, every containment unit quietly disengaged at once. No explosions, no alarms, just the sound of mechanisms unlocking as if they had decided to stop resisting. Security personnel in the hallways stumbled backward as doors slid open without command. Gojo walked out into the corridor. The difference in him was obvious now. The relaxed posture was still there, the hands still in his pockets, but the energy around him had changed. The playful observer had disappeared. In his place was someone who had reached a conclusion. Homelander felt it from across the building. He had been standing in a private conference room, watching everything unfold on screen, telling himself this didn't concern him. But the moment Gojo stepped into the hallway outside the lab, a chill ran through him that he couldn't explain. He left the room immediately and flew toward the research floor. Back in the corridor, armed security teams finally tried to block Gojo's path, not out of confidence but out of desperation. They raised their weapons, shouting commands that echoed uselessly off the walls. Gojo stopped in front of them and looked at their trembling hands. "You shouldn't be here," he said calmly. "This isn't your fault." He lifted one finger. The floor beneath the guards pulled inward for a split second, just enough to gently drop them to their knees without injury. Their weapons clattered away harmlessly. He stepped past them without another word. Cameras followed him from every angle as he moved through the tower like a quiet storm. Employees pressed themselves against walls, staring in disbelief. No one tried to stop him anymore. The illusion that Vought had control inside its own headquarters was dissolving with every step he took. Then Homelander landed at the end of the corridor. The impact cracked the tiles beneath his boots, but Gojo didn't even slow down. He looked at Homelander with the same calm expression he had worn on the street, but now there was something else behind it. Not curiosity, not amusement. Disappointment. "They did this to you too," Gojo said gently. Homelander's eyes burned. "Stay out of this." Gojo stopped a few feet away. "I can't." For a moment, neither of them moved. The hallway cameras captured the image perfectly. The world's most powerful hero standing in the path of a man who had just walked through Vought's greatest secret without resistance. Homelander tried to sound commanding. "You think you can just walk in here and judge us?" Gojo tilted his head. "I'm not judging you. I'm judging the system that made you." That sentence hit harder than any insult. Homelander stepped forward, stopping inches from Gojo's invisible boundary. He could feel it now, the same barrier that had humiliated him earlier. He clenched his fists, but he didn't strike. Because this time, he wasn't trying to win. He was trying to understand why this man wasn't afraid. Gojo looked past him, toward the upper floors of the tower. "I'm going to have a conversation with the people in charge." Homelander didn't move. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know whether he was supposed to stop someone. The executive boardroom at the top of Vought Tower had been designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling glass overlooked the entire city, polished marble reflected the skyline, and a long table stretched across the room like a throne laid sideways. It was a place where decisions were made about heroes, wars, and narratives that shaped public perception. The people sitting there were used to feeling untouchable. Then the doors opened without anyone touching them. Gojo walked in quietly, hands still in his pockets, posture relaxed as if he had arrived early for a meeting that didn't concern him. The executives froze mid-sentence. Some stood instinctively. Others remained seated, too stunned to move. No one had invited him. No one had cleared security. And yet here he was. Gojo looked around the room slowly, taking in the polished environment, the screens on the walls still showing feeds from the research floor. His eyes moved from face to face, reading them with the same ease he had read Homelander earlier. Fear, calculation, denial. "So," he said lightly, "you're the ones in charge." No one answered at first. They were trying to decide whether speaking to him would make things worse. Finally, one of the senior executives cleared his throat. "Mr. Gojo, we can explain everything you saw." Gojo smiled faintly. "I hope so." He walked to the end of the table and leaned against it casually, as if this were a social visit. The casualness was more unsettling than aggression would have been. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting. He was calm. "You built an entire system around artificial power," he continued. "You turned fear into a product. You turned children into investments." The executive tried to maintain composure. "We create heroes who protect the world. The process is complicated." Gojo nodded. "So is ruining lives." Outside the room, Homelander stood in the hallway, listening. He could hear every word through the door. For once, he wasn't the center of the conversation, and that unsettled him more than anything else that had happened today. Inside, another executive leaned forward. "You're very powerful, Mr. Gojo. We don't deny that. But you're misunderstanding the scale of what we manage here. This is global stability." Gojo tilted his head. "You call this stability?" He gestured vaguely toward the city outside the glass. "A world where people worship weapons because they're too afraid not to." The room went quiet again. They were used to controlling conversations, not being analyzed by someone who seemed to see through every justification instantly. One executive tried a different angle. "You're clearly not part of our system, which means you're unpredictable. That makes you dangerous. We could work together instead of against each other." Gojo laughed softly. "You still think this is a negotiation?" He stood up straight and walked toward the window, looking out over the city. His reflection in the glass was calm, almost gentle. "I don't want your power," he said. "I want to see what happens when people stop being afraid of it." That sentence hit harder than any threat. Because they understood immediately what it meant. Their entire empire depended on fear. Without it, the illusion of control collapsed. In the hallway, Homelander clenched his fists. He didn't like the way this conversation was going. It felt like something important was being taken from him without a single punch being thrown. Back in the room, the first executive spoke again, voice tight. "What exactly do you want from us?" Gojo turned back to them. "I want you to stop." "Stop what?" He looked at them with quiet clarity. "All of it." The absurdity of the request hung in the air. This wasn't a demand for money, influence, or authority. He was asking them to dismantle the foundation of their existence. "That's not possible," one of them said. Gojo nodded slowly. "I thought so." He wasn't surprised. He had already reached this conclusion when he saw the children downstairs. He walked toward the door, then paused. "Here, what's going to happen?" he said calmly. "You're going to try to protect this system. You're going to escalate. You're going to convince yourselves that I'm the problem." They didn't interrupt him. "And every time you do," he continued, "people will see more of the truth." He opened the door without touching it. Homelander stood there, staring at him. Gojo gave him a small, almost sympathetic smile. "You should get some rest." Then he walked past him. Inside the boardroom, the executives finally began talking over each other, voices rising in panic. They had just realized something terrifying. This man wasn't trying to destroy Vought. He was letting Vought destroy itself in front of the world. And outside, news alerts were already spreading about leaked footage from the research floor, about the confrontation in the boardroom, about the man who walked through Vought Tower like it was made of paper. The public narrative had shifted permanently. This was no longer a story about heroes. It was a story about control. And Gojo had just stepped outside of it completely. By morning, the footage was everywhere. Not edited clips, not rumors, raw, unfiltered recordings from inside Vought's research floor and executive boardroom, children in hospital beds, scientists panicking, Gojo walking through reinforced glass like it wasn't there, executives failing to justify what they had built. For the first time in decades, the public wasn't debating whether Supes were good or bad. They were asking where they came from. News anchors struggled to keep up with the flood of questions pouring in from every direction. Governments demanded explanations. Activist groups that had been ignored for years suddenly found themselves at the center of global attention. The myth of natural-born heroes had cracked beyond repair. And in the middle of all of it, one image kept replaying. Homelander, unable to touch a man who didn't seem impressed by him. Inside Vought Tower, the atmosphere had shifted from panic to something colder. Damage control had failed. PR had failed. Negotiation had failed. The executives were now discussing something they had sworn never to do. Escalation. Ashley's voice was hoarse. We need to remind people why they're afraid. That sentence hung in the room like a confession. Across the city, Gojo sat calmly on the edge of a rooftop, watching the sunrise. His legs dangled over the side as traffic resumed far below, the world trying to pretend it hadn't changed overnight. He sipped from a convenient store drink he had picked up on the way, looking like a tourist enjoying the view. Butcher, Huey, and Starlight stood a short distance behind him. You realize the entire country talking about you, right? Huey asked. Gojo shrugged. They're not talking about me, they're talking about what they saw. Starlight folded her arms. Vought going to push back hard. Gojo nodded slightly. Of course they are. Systems like this don't collapse quietly. Butcher studied him carefully. You're not planning to stop them, are you? Gojo glanced back with a faint smile. I don't need to. That answer made Butcher uneasy, but he understood it. The damage had already been done. Vought wasn't fighting Gojo anymore. They were fighting their own exposure. Then the alerts began. Emergency broadcasts cut into news channels across the city. Reports of Supes interventions happening simultaneously in multiple districts. Not rescues, displays. Homelander had taken flight, smashing through buildings to stop a robbery that could have been handled by police. Other members of the Seven were deployed to incidents that didn't require their presence. They weren't saving people. They were performing. But the tone was wrong. The force was excessive. People watching could feel it. This wasn't heroism, it was intimidation. On the rooftop, Gojo watched quietly. They're trying to restore fear, he said. Huey looked confused. By causing more damage. Gojo nodded. They don't know any other way. In one district, a Supes slammed a suspect through 3 walls in front of dozens of civilians. In another, Homelander landed in the middle of traffic, forcing cars to scatter just to arrest a petty criminal. The message was clear. You still need us. But something had changed. People weren't cheering anymore. They were filming from a distance. They were backing away instead of stepping forward. The admiration had been replaced by caution. Inside Vought Tower, executives watched the feeds nervously. This wasn't going the way they expected. Instead of restoring confidence, the displays were reminding people of how dangerous Supes really were. Ashley whispered, "Why aren't they reacting the way they used to?" Because the illusion was gone. On the rooftop, Gojo stood up slowly. His eyes tracked Homelander's movements across the city without needing a screen. 6 eyes could feel the disturbance in the air, the emotional ripple spreading through crowds. They're realizing something, Gojo said. Butcher raised an eyebrow. What's that? That fear was the only thing holding this together. As if to prove his point, a crowd in one district didn't scatter when a Supes landed nearby. They stood their ground, phones raised, watching carefully instead of cowering. The Supes hesitated for half a second, unsure how to react without the usual response. That hesitation was broadcast everywhere. And people noticed. Homelander noticed too. He hovered above an intersection, scanning the faces below. No cheers, No awe, just wary eyes and recording phones. He clenched his fists, feeling something slipping away that he couldn't punch back into place. Then he looked up and saw Gojo standing on the distant rooftop, watching. Not interfering, just observing. That made it worse. Homelander flew toward him at full speed, landing hard on the rooftop. "This is your fault," he said through clenched teeth. Gojo sipped his drink calmly. "No, this was always here." Homelander gestured angrily toward the city. "They're losing faith." Gojo nodded. "They're seeing clearly." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved quietly around them as sirens echoed faintly below. Homelander realized something terrifying. Gojo wasn't trying to take his place. He was removing the need for one. And down in the streets, more crowds began standing their ground when Supes arrived, watching instead of worshipping. The world wasn't turning against Supes. It was simply no longer believing in them. By the second night, Vought stopped pretending this could be managed with messaging. Emergency calls had poured in from politicians, investors, and military partners who were suddenly questioning whether Supes were an asset or a liability. Confidence in the brand had dropped faster than any market crash in the company's history. The boardroom conversation shifted from recovery to survival. Someone finally said the word no one wanted to say. Neutralize him. It wasn't spoken with confidence. It was spoken because every other option had failed. Across multiple secure facilities, experimental weapons that had never left testing phases were prepared for deployment. High-yield energy cannons, containment fields, chemical suppressants designed specifically for Supe physiology. None of them had been built for someone like Gojo, but desperation made people believe in unlikely solutions. Ashley listened to the plan with pale disbelief. If this fails, we're finished. One of the executives replied quietly, "We're already finished if we don't try." Across the city, Gojo walked through a quiet street lit by emergency lights and distant sirens. The atmosphere felt different now. Not fearful, tense, coordinated. He could feel intent gathering in multiple directions at once, like a storm forming around him from every angle. He smiled faintly. "Ah, there it is." Butcher stepped beside him. "They're making a move, aren't they?" Gojo nodded. "A big one." Huey looked around nervously. "Should we get out of here?" Gojo shook his head gently. "No, you should watch." From rooftops, armored drones rose into the air, positioning themselves in a perfect circle overhead. Military vehicles blocked both ends of the street. Floodlights snapped on, bathing the area in harsh white light. Loudspeakers crackled with forced authority. "Gojo Satoru, remain where you are. This is a containment operation." Gojo looked up at the drones curiously. "Containment," he repeated, amused. Energy cannons fired first. Blinding beams struck him from 4 directions at once, powerful enough to vaporize concrete. The street behind him erupted into molten debris as the blasts curved and split around his body, carving glowing scars into the buildings behind him. Gojo didn't move. He looked over his shoulder at the damage. "You're going to ruin the neighborhood." The second wave came from the ground. A containment field activated beneath his feet, generating a humming barrier designed to trap even the strongest Supes in a confined space. Gojo glanced down. "That's new." He lifted one hand slightly. The field warped inward, folding like paper before collapsing into itself with a quiet pop of displaced air. Inside Vought Tower, people stared at the screens in horror. None of this was supposed to look easy for him. But it did. Then Homelander arrived. He didn't land gently this time. He crashed into the street with enough force to shatter asphalt, eyes glowing red with something beyond anger. This wasn't about image anymore. This was personal. "You brought this on yourself," Homelander said. Gojo tilted his head. "Did I?" Homelander fired his heat vision again, not to test, not to intimidate, but to destroy. The beams bent around Gojo's body like always, slicing into a drone overhead and sending it spiraling down in flames. Gojo watched it fall. "You're helping me more than you realize." That sentence hit Homelander harder than anything else had so far. Around them, the drones continued firing. Missiles launched. Sonic blasts echoed through the street. The combined assault turned the entire block into a war zone. And at the center of it, Gojo stood calmly with his hands in his pockets. Civilians watching from buildings nearby recorded everything, not with fear, but with stunned realization. This wasn't a hero stopping a threat. This was a corporation attacking someone who hadn't harmed anyone. The narrative flipped in real time. Butcher watched from a safe distance, shaking his head. They just made him a symbol. Starlight nodded. They made themselves the villains. In the middle of the chaos, Gojo finally sighed softly. "I really didn't want to do this," he said. He raised one finger toward the sky. A subtle blue distortion formed above the street, almost invisible at first. Then gravity itself seemed to shift. The drones overhead were pulled inward violently, crushed together in midair as if an invisible hand had grabbed them all at once. They collided in a metallic implosion and fell to the ground in a heap of twisted wreckage. Silence followed, not because the attack had stopped, but because everyone had just seen Gojo use something new. And it had been effortless. Homelander stared at the wreckage, then back at Gojo. For the first time, he wasn't angry. He was unsure. Inside Vought Tower, executives realized the truth too late. They hadn't escalated the situation. They had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Because Gojo was no longer observing their system. He was responding to it. The wreckage of drones and burning vehicles littered the street in a wide circle around Gojo. Smoke rolled upward in slow spirals, illuminated by flickering emergency lights. For a few seconds, no one fired, no one shouted, no one moved. The silence wasn't tactical. It was shock. Gojo stood in the center of it all with the same relaxed posture, but something had changed in the air around him. The playful restraint he had shown since arriving in this world was thinning, not because he was angry, but because he had reached a quiet conclusion about what Vought would keep doing if left alone. Homelander felt it before anyone else did. He hovered a few feet above the ground, staring at Gojo with an expression that no one had ever seen on his face before. It wasn't rage. It wasn't arrogance. It was the dawning realization that he had pushed someone far beyond what this world was built to handle. "You're escalating," Homelander said, trying to sound in control. Gojo looked at him calmly. "No, you are." From the rooftops and windows, civilians were still filming. News helicopters kept their distance now, lenses zoomed in as far as possible. The entire country was watching a confrontation that no longer looked like a hero stopping a threat. It looked like a superpower trying desperately to overpower something it didn't understand. Inside Vought Tower, executives were shouting conflicting orders. Some wanted to pull back immediately. Others demanded they continue before it was too late. They were arguing about pride while the situation outside slipped beyond their influence. Ashley's voice broke. "Call them off, call everything off." But the orders took time to travel. And in that time, another missile launched. It wasn't supposed to. A nervous operator panicked and fired without authorization. The missile screamed through the air toward Gojo, trailing fire and smoke. Gojo didn't even look at it. It stopped in midair, inches from his back, caught in the invisible space where nothing could reach him. He turned slowly and examined it with mild curiosity. "This is getting irresponsible," he said softly. He raised 2 fingers. A red distortion pulsed outward from him in a sudden, violent wave. The missile didn't explode. It was flung backward with unimaginable force, ripping through 3 armored vehicles and sending them tumbling like toys. The shockwave alone shattered windows across several blocks. Everyone watching felt it in their chest. This wasn't defense anymore. This was a warning. Homelander landed again, staring at the destruction behind him. "You're going to kill people." Gojo's eyes moved past him to the buildings filled with civilians. "That's exactly what I'm trying to avoid." He looked up toward Vought Tower, gaze piercing through layers of glass and steel. His expression was calm, but the decision behind it was unmistakable. "They're not going to stop," he said. For the first time, there was no humor in his voice at all. The air around him felt heavier, denser, like pressure building before a storm breaks. Even people watching from miles away felt something change without understanding why. A quiet dread spread through the crowd as if instinct itself was warning them. Butcher felt it too. What's he about to do? Starlight shook her head slowly. Something we're not ready for. Gojo closed his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them again, the world around him seemed to slow. "Domain expansion," he said quietly. The words meant nothing to anyone listening. Then everything changed. The street, the buildings, the sky, all of it was swallowed by a vast, endless void that replaced reality in an instant. Not darkness, not light. An infinite space filled with overwhelming information, pressing in from every direction at once. Homelander froze. His eyes widened as his mind was flooded with more sensation than he could process. Sound, sight, thought, memory, all of it poured into him at once without mercy. He tried to move, to speak, but his body refused to respond. Inside Vought Tower, every screen went white. Cameras failed. Sensors overloaded. Systems crashed as if reality itself had stopped cooperating. People inside the building dropped to their knees, clutching their heads as a fraction of the domain's effect brushed against them. Civilians in nearby buildings felt it too. Not fully, not directly, but enough to make them collapse in confusion and panic as their senses overloaded for a split second. And in the center of it all, Gojo stood perfectly still. Calm, focused, in control. He wasn't using this to hurt anyone. He was using it to stop everything. The drones, the soldiers, Homelander. Every active threat in the area was rendered completely helpless without a single drop of blood spilled. After a few seconds that felt like an eternity, the void vanished. Reality snapped back into place. Homelander dropped to one knee, gasping for air, eyes unfocused. Soldiers lay on the ground, disoriented and trembling. Vought's entire surveillance system remained offline, fried by something they couldn't measure. Gojo exhaled softly. "I really didn't want to do that," he said. And everyone watching understood one thing with terrifying clarity. Vought had forced him to use a power that this world was never meant to experience. When the void disappeared, the city didn't return to normal. It returned to silence. Cars sat abandoned in the middle of streets. Soldiers and Vought personnel lay where they had fallen, conscious but unable to stand, their minds still reeling from something they couldn't describe. Homelander remained on one knee, staring at the ground like he had forgotten how to be himself. And Gojo stood in the center of it all, hands back in his pockets, breathing as calmly as if he had just finished a short walk. He looked around slowly, checking every direction with careful attention. 6 eyes confirmed what he already intended. No civilians had been harmed. No buildings had collapsed. The only thing that had broken was momentum. Vought's momentum. News helicopters hovered at a distance, cameras cautiously zooming back in now that the whiteout had passed. Reporters spoke in hushed, confused tones because none of them understood what they had just witnessed. They only knew that something fundamental had happened. The world's strongest hero had been stopped without injury. Without a fight. Without resistance, Homelander slowly lifted his head and looked at Gojo. There was no anger left in his expression, no pride, just a hollow, searching confusion. "What are you?" he asked quietly. Gojo gave him a small, almost sympathetic smile. "Someone who doesn't need people to be afraid." That answer stayed with Homelander longer than any blow could have. Across the city, people began stepping out from buildings cautiously. They weren't running. They weren't cheering. They were observing. The fear that had always followed Supe activity was gone, replaced by something new. Distance. Butcher approached from down the street, stepping around fallen equipment and dazed soldiers. Huey and Starlight followed close behind, staring at the aftermath in disbelief. "You ended it," Huey said. Gojo shook his head gently. "No, I stopped it." Starlight looked at the scattered Vought units. "They can't come back from this." Gojo glanced toward Vought Tower in the distance. Its windows reflected the sunrise, quiet and still. "They'll try." Inside that tower, executives sat in stunned silence, staring at blank monitors and emergency reports. Their security systems were fried, their forces incapacitated, their symbol of power brought to his knees in front of the world. They weren't discussing retaliation anymore. They were discussing survival. On the street, Homelander slowly stood up. He didn't fly. He didn't speak again. He simply walked past Gojo without making eye contact and disappeared down the block like a man leaving a funeral. Gojo watched him go with a thoughtful expression. "He's not the problem," he murmured. Butcher heard it. "Then what is?" Gojo looked at the city, at the cameras, at the people who were no longer looking at Supes with awe. "The idea that people need them," he replied. As the morning grew brighter, news coverage shifted from panic to analysis. Commentators began asking questions that had never been asked publicly before. Governments demanded investigations. Parents demanded answers about Compound V. Former Vought employees started coming forward with information they had buried for years. The system wasn't collapsing because Gojo destroyed it. It was collapsing because people had seen it clearly. Gojo stretched slightly, as if loosening his shoulders after a long day. The serious expression faded, replaced once again by the faint, easy smile he wore so naturally. "Well," he said lightly, "that was educational." Huey stared at him. "You're just leaving." Gojo nodded. "My work here is done." Butcher frowned. "That's it. You drop into our world, flip it upside down, and walk away." Gojo shrugged. "I didn't flip anything. I just showed everyone what was already there." He started walking down the street, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed like always. Behind him, the world he had stepped into was already changing in ways that could not be reversed. Vought would never regain the same authority. Supes would never be viewed the same way again. Fear would no longer be automatic. And for the first time in decades, people were looking at heroes without feeling small. Gojo paused briefly at the corner of the street and glanced back once. "Try not to rebuild it the same way," he said casually. Then he turned the corner and was gone. Not vanished. Just gone. And across the city, across the country, across the world, one understanding settled quietly into place. The age of fear had ended. But the power vacuum left behind was only just beginning to form. Something new would rise from it. Something no one was prepared for. And this time, there would be no one like Gojo standing in the middle to keep it from spiraling out of control.